friends. I am recording this special and messy, somewhat long video because I am in a tizzy. This is, I don't know, our third, maybe fourth assessment form for one of my kids who is neurodivergent. Over time, as they age and try and qualify for different accommodations, you need to fill these forms out, as many parents with neurodivergent kids you're probably familiar with. I avoid answering these forms, and I kind of put them off because they are so remarkably stressful and frustrating to answer, both because they're the words in them are, I'm trying to think of a non-ableist way to say this, ignorant, and also because I understand what forms like this do while it's just on a piece of paper. They're actually quite stigmatizing and reinforce a lot of negative bias in people who don't understand the power of survey forms and principles of consistency. So let's jump right in. So the first one we're looking at, I'm not going to show you because it's got my kid's name on it, but it's the NICHQ Vanderbilt Assessment Follow-Up Parent Informant Form. There's also a teacher form, which I am actively refusing to send to our teacher, and you'll understand why very soon. This one is specifically for ADHD, for testing for executive functioning disabilities, which my child has, and I could just tell them because I know what executive functioning disabilities look like. But because of the medical model of disability, and basically the paternalism of our medical establishments, people believe that caregivers are too ignorant to be able to just report what's going on with their kids without filling out a form and having it tabulated into a series of numbers, because medical professionals just don't trust parents and caregivers to understand that something is going on with their kid. So the first thing that we have is you're filling out this label of attributes, and you're supposed to say never, occasionally, often, or very often. Now, the problem, one of the first red flag here is that instead of the word attributes, they're using the word symptoms, which I scribbled out and wrote attributes, because again, with the medical model of disability, we're suggesting that symptoms, ADHD is some sort of disability, is some sort of disease, or a failing or something that's broken in the brain, as opposed to a natural part of normal human diversity. So symptoms versus attributes, one of them is stigmatizing language. Now, when you are a parent or a caregiver or an educator, and you're trying to provide and care for a child who's having problems navigating the world that is not designed for their particular neurology, you're already going to be at a certain level of anxiety and stress. So you get this form in here. Let's assume that you're not like me and you don't know what neurodiversity is. You don't understand what it's like to navigate environments that aren't made for you. All you see is the exterior behavior of your child. And you get these forms and you think, gosh, there's so many things wrong with my children already, because you know that your child is outside of the norm, and for many people they want their child to be inside of the norm, which is sad. So you get this form, and then it reinforces that bias, suggesting that your neurodiverse child is broken or there's something wrong with them, as opposed to they just think differently. So it starts out with questions such as does not pay attention to details or makes careless mistakes, for example, with homework. The word careless is a very subjective word, and it implies that the child is not trying. They're not trying to do their homework. It suggests that there's some level of ability and refusal to maintain that ability, as opposed to what many of us with executive functioning disabilities could tell you is that we are trying so much harder and being so much more careful than our holistic peers. But the problem is that we just have disabilities and we have something that we need to work on. Like, you don't talk about someone who has walking disabilities and call them careless because they trip. They have a disability. It is a physical problem. We have a we have a challenge with our brain that makes navigating this particular expectation problematic for us and difficult for us. But that does not mean that we are problematic or that we are careless or that we're not trying. So right out of the gate, question number one is your child careless? And of course you have to answer that. For many people who are holistic, they're going to answer that. The question as it was intended rather than as it was worded. So when you say often or very often your child is careless, that's reinforcing, well, a lot of snow just fell off of our solar panels. That is reinforcing the recommitment bias of assuming that your child is not trying or that they're somehow deficient as opposed to just different. This form is a little bit better than the others, but I will go on to say number 12, runs about or climbs too much when remaining seated is expected. So that's got two problems with it. First of all, too much is completely subjective because depending on what culture you're from and what kind of activities and how active your family is, too much is so completely subjective, where I personally don't think that our kids should be sitting down, and I think a lot of people could tell you, especially in our little, our specific type of community, that sitting down at a desk for like 18 hours a day is not healthy and it shouldn't be expected. The other issue with that is that when remaining seated is expected, as many people who work with early childhood education and who are getting on that next crested wave beyond kids being buckled down to their seats, the expectations that we're setting for kids are completely unreasonable. We are expecting too much and we're taking away things like recess and other ways of coping with being forced to sit at a desk all day. So the issue of it being subjective and the issue of expectations. Now, if the school we're sending him to has unreasonable expectations for any child, our child is going to look like he's having a problem. So again, that's just a nonsense question. That's just designed to make a child look like they're deficient. Let's not even get into the fact that many of these say his and her when just no pronouns could also work, because why not let intersex and non-binary kids feel like they're completely erased from this subject? And this will also remind transphobic parents that their child who tends towards trans or non-binary, as many neurotypical children do. We have a higher correlation between gender non-conforming and neurodiverse kids, probably because neurodiverse kids are willing to be like, yeah, gender is a construct and it's bullshit. So you already have these people who are unfamiliar with neurodivergence and are unfamiliar with gender outside the binary, it's just one more reminder for people whose kids are not gender conforming that, oh gosh, there's something wrong with my kid because they are not a his and a her. That's a separate thing. But again, some of these forms, they make you select male or female right at the top, and they insist on putting pronouns where pronouns just aren't necessary, such as has difficulty waiting his or her turn. Why not just say has difficulty waiting their turn or waiting for their turn? It just speaks to the level of ignorance for people who are studying neurodivergent children who don't understand that neurodivergent children also have a higher incidence of being gender nonconforming. Okay, so talks too much. Again, that's subjective too much. Not talks more than their peers, which would be a valid question, or talks more than you would expect, or something like that. But actually talks too much, that subjective level, is ridiculous, both because of cultural standards, because what we expect of certain children, and what we expect of children based on their gender. So growing up as an Asian girl, I was expected to be basically silent all the time. If I was a boy, particularly if I was a white boy, and I spoke the same amount, I would not be considered talking too much, but because I was an Asian girl, I was constantly told to be quiet, and I need to be more quiet, and I need to stop talking, because of that perception that Asian people and girls particularly should be quiet. So for someone answering that question talks too much, they would select very often for someone like me, or occasionally or never for a white boy. So again, completely ignorant to cultural and gender implications on these forms. Then you have questions like argues with adults. Again, that's a cultural issue. And it also, how much you consider arguing a bad thing. In our family in particular, arguing is a good thing, and we actually encourage it. We also aren't, we try not to be ageist, so if our kids take issue with something that we're saying and they argue with us and they believe that one of our rules is unjust or unfair, I want them to speak up and I want them to argue with me. That's a cultural thing, as opposed to something in a family where submission, particularly for children to their elders, is normal. That's going to be a completely different cultural situation. So ignoring the fact that not everyone is white for these forms is severely problematic. And then number 21, actively defies or refuses to go along with adults' requests or rules. Again, if you know me, you know that that is something that I actively encourage. If an adult's requests or rules are harming someone, or and we're teaching kids that they need to speak up when so much snow is falling down. We are teaching our kids that when they're in the early stages of grooming, they should be speaking up and saying, hey, something doesn't feel right. So it doesn't get to the point where they've already been sexually abused. So we can't teach our kids, on one hand, that you need to speak up when something is a little bit amiss, so that way it doesn't go too far, but also say that it's not okay to argue with adults. That's a problem. And again, pointing out argues with adults and defies or refuses to go along with adults' requests or rules suggests that these are bad things and that they're something that is outside the norm, when no, that's just outside of a norm that reinforces white supremacy. Is angry or resentful. Again, that is laying on an implication onto a child, or reading a child's behavior as emotionally loaded without actually knowing what that child's behavior is. So if we're saying that a child is angry or resentful, that's assuming that we can read that child's mind and it's based on their behavior. So one of the things about being a child and having anxiety is many types of anxiety, stress, fear, present as aggressive behaviors, but that doesn't mean that they're angry. It means they're afraid or stressed or traumatized. So if we're answering for that child and taking on their voice and saying that they're angry or resentful, that is requiring the mental calculation on part of the grown-up who is answering this form to label their child as angry or resentful, when really what they're doing is they're screaming and they're hitting and they're flipping out and they're having meltdowns because they are having a crisis, life or death panic, anxiety attack, and meltdown response. Problematic. And this is just assuming that your child even does have angry or resentful presenting anxiety or issues relating to navigating an ableist world while neurodivergent, as opposed to the kinds who pull in and melt down. I wasn't diagnosed as autistic until I became an adult, because I didn't present as angry or resentful, because both because of cultural, racial, and gender issues. I was encouraged, and it was normal, and it was easier for me to melt down and shut down and be quiet and basically self-harm, which is something that doesn't present on the outside. So I will not go to bed. I have ranting to do. So I scrolled all over this form, basically saying that this is the cause of ableism and internalized stigma and things like that. So let's move on to the much, much worse one, which is one of those fill-in-the-dot forms where basically the evaluator rips off the front form, so they won't even see my ranting, which is very frustrating. All they're going to see is a bunch of little dots that are filled in. They're going to tabulate them and decide whether or not my child is autistic. This is the WPS SRS2 Auto Score Form, School Age, written by John N. Constantino, MD. Fuck you, John N. Constantino, MD. You're killing children. So we have that giant male or female gender thing, which I refuse to answer because that's nonsense. As we've learned, there are more intersex kids than there are redheads in the world, so why are we erasing them all? So we have a scale of not true, sometimes true, often true, and almost always true. And they ask questions like, seems much more fidgety in social situations than when alone. Now, I don't personally videotape my child when he's alone. No judgment if you do. I'm sure you have your reasons, but how the fuck would I know? Because he's alone. Number 2, expressions on his or her face don't match what he or she is saying. Again, unnecessary pronouns could be very easily rephrased and less awkwardly phrased without pronouns. But there is no right facial expression for your emotions, just because some people might have a flat affect or might have exaggerated facial expressions like I do, because I have learned how to express myself non-verbally, doesn't mean that their facial expressions don't match what they're saying. This is taking a very centrist view on holistic people being the norm and being the proper matched of faces to what they're saying, which makes no sense because sarcasm doesn't work that way, and there's so many problems with this. So from there on, when under stress, he or she shows rigid or inflexible patterns of behavior. That seems odd. Now that seems odd. Why? Why do we need to add that? Why do we have to add that extra bias of stigma onto there so that way parents are answering this going forward, subconsciously kind of forgetting the actual questions in there, but internalizing that idea that their child is odd and otherwise deficient or strange or weird or outside what is acceptable. Behaves in ways that seem strange or bizarre. Again, a garbage question that is completely subjective and also ignores cultural issues. What if you're a second generation, that your child is a second generation immigrant or third culture kid? To my father, who was born in Malaysia, I am very odd, but it's not because I'm autistic, it's because I'm raised very American. Now, clings to adults seems too dependent on them. Again, that stigmatizing of dependent, which is one of the reasons why we see disabled people as a burden or lesser, is because the idea of being dependent on someone in this American white supremacist culture is a bad thing. Dependence is not a bad thing. Interdependence is healthy and necessary for human survival because we are a social species. If anything, we are not dependent enough on each other. So that is a very weird, gross question. Takes things too literally and doesn't get the real meaning of a conversation. Now, so if we're existing within a place where people like me who think literally and people who think metaphorically, like many holistic people, take different meanings out of conversation, use words differently, it's basically like we're speaking different languages. And just because we're speaking different languages and pulling different meaning out of words and using words to ascribe different meanings to the messages that we're sending does not mean that one is more real or one is, fake. And then also too literally also implies that people who speak literally are wrong, which is wrong. Is not well coordinated. It's so subjective. Is not coordinated as comparison to peers would be a good question. Is not coordinated given their physical attributes would also be a good question. My child, who we are doing this assessment for, happens to be unusually large, which means he grows much faster than other children and he is more clumsy because he's an inch taller every single week. He's 7 and he's my height. So the problem is they're looking, what they want to ask is, for your child's age and for their size, are they having some fine motor control problems? Or are they having motor control problems, which does correlate with neurodivergence? Why not ask that? Why not say compared to peers? But instead they're saying is not well coordinated. I mean, no child is particularly well coordinated. So is able to understand the meaning of other people's tones of voice and facial expressions. This is ignoring the background of what we've taught our children. We've been teaching our child since birth what these kinds of eyebrows mean when they are on an allistic face and how allistic people tend to use them, because we are teaching our child to speak allistic because he has to navigate this culture and this language, because he's being raised by an autistic person and the child of an autistic person. So of course he can figure that out because we've taught him that language, but they're ignoring the fact that many people, particularly neurodivergent families, and neurodivergence does tend to be genetic, are teaching that language from birth because they've had to learn facial expressions and nonverbal communication manually. Hence my exaggerated facial expressions. Avoids eye contact or has unusual eye contact. Again, that's assuming that we haven't been training him from birth, which we have. They should say under duress, perhaps, because yes, his eye contact does get weird under duress because he's busy thinking about other things and he's stressed. Shows unusual sensory interests, for example, mouthing or spinning objects, or strange ways of playing with toys. Again, those two subjective words, unusual and strange. This is assuming that their parents also don't stim. They're asking if your child stims. They're assuming that the parents don't stim, so if you're autistic and you don't know it and you stim all the time and you think that's normal and your child also stims, they're less likely to get diagnosed and get the accommodations that they need because their parent considers their behavior normal. This is a garbage, stupid question. They should just ask. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said stupid. That's ableist. This is a garbage question. They should have asked, performs repetitive behaviors, which is typical and corresponds with a lot of autistic behavior and ADHD. Do you see my cats freaking out? They're totally fighting. Okay. Does not join group activities unless told to do so, as well as avoid starting social interactions with peers or adults. That is something that they should only be asking for school-age children of a certain age because that is a result of exposure anxiety. Exposure anxiety, I wish I could come up with the name of the doctor who came up with it. It's an autistic person. Exposure anxiety is exactly what it sounds like. You're exposed to social situations where you get basically metaphorically or physically slapped in the face for failing to conform to social expectations, and you learn to fear social interaction. I don't leave the house because social interaction is terrifying. So, but someone of the age of first, second, even early in elementary school might not have learned that social exposure anxiety because they just haven't been slapped in the face enough, metaphorically and physically. But they do eventually pick it up. This is another cause of many kids who end up with a whole bunch of diagnoses before they finally, in middle school, end up with a proper autism diagnosis, because they're kind of giving this blanket, school age form, when it really should be more targeted to specific ages and experiences. Offers comfort to others when they are sad. Again, that's another problem. So first of all, they're asking, can your child identify when other people are sad? I could just say no, my child cannot identify when other people are sad. But instead they have this weird way of asking, when my child is sad, because we have told him your brother is sad, he offers comfort in a way that is not comforting. That's another thing, is offers actually comforting behavior, as opposed to doing what he wants. And this is something that we've discussed where their teachers keep telling them, observe the golden rule, which is treat people the way that you wanted to be treated. And we keep having to go back and undo that harmful learning, because the way that we want to be treated as autistic people, or even as individuals, is not necessarily the way that other people want to be treated. For example, my husband, who is tall and white and strong and capable of defending himself, wouldn't mind being catcalled on the street. I find it terrifying. I'm autistic. I don't like having to look in people's eyes. I actually prefer it when people don't, but allistic people do prefer when you look in people's eyes. So the idea of what is comforting and what is not comforting is an issue of many different aspects of your identity beyond even cultural, because looking people's eyes is also a cultural thing, but also in terms of social power and how likely you are to get attacked, and also neurodivergence. Can't get his or her, I'm going to scratch out those pronouns, can't get their mind off something once they start thinking about it. Again, can't as opposed to does not want to. A lot of people tend to misdiagnose autism as oppositional defiant disorder in the early ages, because they assume that a child is willfully, maliciously choosing to disobey, as opposed to they just can or cannot. So when they are asking a guardian to write can or cannot, that's again assuming that they know the child's ability, when the whole point of these assessments is to help caretakers understand what are your child's abilities so we can accommodate them. But apparently, no, it's just about stigmatizing them. Oh gosh, there's a whole other side of this form that I didn't even see. Okay, so again, let's just wrap this up. Stigmatizing language within these forms, sent to vulnerable caregivers who are unsure and just starting out this process of assessing their children and figuring out what their children's disabilities and needs are, is harmful. To paint everything as a negative. Not one of these things has been painted as a positive, like, is great at focusing on one thing for 6 hours. They don't ask that. Why don't they ask about the good stuff, right? Could tell you every dinosaur that has ever existed's name. That's an amazing thing. Like, is very knowledgeable about one specific topic. They don't ask about the good stuff. They only ask about the stuff that is a deficit, because these people clearly see autism as a deficit. Calling things symptoms and side effects, when really most of them are coping mechanisms for dealing with an ableist universe. And also, basically the entire thing reads like Trump's mainstream media accountability survey, which is full of leading questions that's designed to get you to agree that your kids are deficient and in need of fixing or compliance therapy. And they feed into that recommitment bias that suggests that there's something wrong with your child, as opposed there's something different about your child. And when they ask parents to fill this out, but not just parents, they also gave us a second set of forms, slightly differently worded for some reason, and sent them for the teachers. I don't want my teachers to have these forms, because I don't want my teachers to have the recommitment bias of seeing my kid as a burden and a reject and broken and not the way that a normal child should be, because he is a normal child and he's exactly the way he should be.